Welcome to Anatomy Physiology. We're starting Chapter 12 on the nervous system, and for the next 4 chapters we're going to be talking about nerves. So here is an overview. You have nerves in your brain, and you're not really allowed to call them nerves. You have to call them neurons. A nerve cell is a neuron. And then you have cranial nerves. You have spinal nerves, you have peripheral nerves. So we're going to learn about the different kinds of nerves and how they interact, how they send messages to the brain, if they even need to send messages to the brain. We're going to learn about short-circuiting, we're going to learn about interneurons. So there's a variety of things we're going to be covering. But I thought this was a kind of a neat picture. I found it. So people are always taking selfies. Well, here's a selfie with no makeup on, and actually no skin. There are 2 professions that everyone thinks of with great awe. One of them is a rocket scientist. They say, oh, you're so smart, you think you're a rocket scientist. And the other one is a neurosurgeon, someone that could actually operate on these tiny, tiny little things. We have a whole chapter coming up in a couple of chapters that will just talk about the brain, consciousness, your personality, why you behave the way you do. And if you're interested in this, you can study neurobiology. And so you're talking about the behaviors that people do, but you're also talking about the anatomy physiology of the nerves and the central nervous system, the brain. It's amazing to me that people have taken the time and the effort to remove the skin, the skull, the meninges, which are the covering of the brain, and show you these nerve bundles. How amazing is this? And then your teeth. He's like, how can that hurt so badly? And when you get a root canal, they drill through and they drill down the root and they kill the connection to the nerve. Then they fill your tooth in with some sort of a rubberized plastic stuff. But they usually only do that if you keep getting infections. If there's an opening that allows bacteria in this area, and if they leave things where they don't do a root canal and they leave the bacteria to grow in this area, then remember that these teeth fit into gomphoses, which is the hole in the jaw, and it can actually start dissolving away the jawbone around the tooth. I just love this picture. One of the problems they have in most textbooks is they just draw a flat nerve. And whoever did this shows you that it is a 3-dimensional thing. So you have the cell body right here, and you're going to have all the stuff that you normally think about, the mitochondria, endoplasmic reticulum, the nucleus, all the things you'd normally expect to find in a cell. But then you're going to have these processes sticking out here, and they call them dendrites because they look like trees. And then you're going to have one process out in the peripheral nervous system. The periphery is outside of the brain. And you're going to see that you have a long, long axon. And we're going to learn about Schwann cells, other accessory cells that you have to help out the nerves. But I just like this because there's really only 3 major parts to a nerve: the cell body, the dendrites, and the axons. And the information usually comes in to the dendrites, passes through the cell membrane, and then leaves, or it goes away through the axon. So I always just remember axons take messages away. And on the other end, you don't know where this is going to end up out here, but you could have a gland, so you're going to secrete something. You could have another nerve, so you're going to stimulate another nerve, or you could have a muscle. So there's a variety of things that you could have this end of the axon sending the message to. And I always enjoy my jokes. So there are 100 billion nerves in your body, give or take a few 100,000. And there are people who can irritate all of them. We've talked about carpal tunnel syndrome before, but basically it's where you have so much inflammation under the retinaculum that you shut off blood flow and you shut off the nerve impulses. And if you keep putting compression on it, the nerve can die. And so we always want to be aware of carpal tunnel syndrome, especially in this day and age where everybody is playing on their computer all the time or playing on their phone. It seems like we're doing repetitive motions with our wrist over and over again, typing on a computer keyboard. It helps when you're talking about the nervous system to also bring in the endocrine system, because some of the things that the endocrine system does and some of the things that the nervous system does kind of overlaps. When you are wanting just a gland, just that gland, or just that muscle to contract, then you would probably use the nervous system because it just does local information. So that axon we saw is going to come out and it's just going to talk to one area. The endocrine system, on the other hand, just squirts hormone out into the circulatory system and it's carried throughout the body in the bloodstream. And we'll talk about the fat-soluble kinds of hormones, and then the ones that are proteins. And we'll learn how they cause a reaction. Where you have some overlap, you've heard of adrenaline. We really should be calling it epinephrine. That's technically what it's called, but in America we tend to call it adrenaline because we were raised calling it adrenaline. But when you have like an allergic reaction and you need to quell or to quiet the histamine and the whole anaphylaxis that's going on, you use an EpiPen. So basically you just shoot the person with adrenaline. So epinephrine. Now, we also have some types of nerves that will just direct epinephrine into a synapse. So it will just do it locally. So you have the endocrine that can send epinephrine or adrenaline throughout the body. And then you have the nerves that just send it to one small area to get a reaction just in that area. So same chemical, but two different ways of secreting it, whole body versus local action. The last chapter that we'll do this semester will be on your senses, your hearing, your sight, all your different inputs that you can send to the brain. So the brain and the spinal cord, just those two things make up the central nervous system, and everything else is considered to be the peripheral nervous system, or the PNS. Now, this says the CNS processes information that the senses send to it. It relates it to past experiences. It determines the appropriate response. And then it sends out usually a message to the skeletal system and says, okay, I need you to do this. But sometimes you need to get a reaction quickly. So we're going to talk about reflexes in a few chapters. And a reflex, you don't have to stop and think about it. You don't have to send the information up to the brain. So you put your hand on a hot stove or on a, I don't know, I've watched a lot of women touch an iron to see if it's hot. Or when the server puts your food down on the table and says, be careful of this plate, it's hot. And the first thing that the customer does is reach out, put their hand on the plate. So you have two things that happen. One of them is you have a reflex that tells you, hey, that's hot. Get your hand off, and you pull your hand away. And that does not require the brain. The information comes from burning your finger to your spinal column and then right back out and says, okay, lift your hand up off of there. Meanwhile, the information can also go up to the brain, go up the spinal cord and up to the brain, and the brain does all this thing where it processes the information, relates it to past experiences, and determines the appropriate response. But it really doesn't matter because you've already taken your hand off of the hot plate or off of the hot iron or whatever it is that's hurting you. But now your brain is processing. You think, man, that was so stupid. I just heard that person say, don't touch that. Or the person who puts their finger on the iron to see if it's hot, they're like, man, I did that the last time I ironed. That's really dumb. I need to find a new way to find out if the iron is hot besides touching it with my finger. So you can do some things like this, but then you will have reflexes that we'll talk about. All right, and then once it's determined the appropriate response, it'll send the command to a muscle or gland or another nerve. So if you remember, there are three parts to a nerve. You got the dendrites, the cell body, and then you have the axon. Usually the axon is just one axon. There are unusual nerves, unipolar and things like that. But in general, you have the axons. And if you have a bunch of nerves hanging out together, like when we did the chapter on muscles, you usually don't just find a muscle cell, just a muscle fiber. You see a cluster of them. You see a bunch of them that makes up a whole muscle. Well, you're going to find that you rarely have just one nerve hanging out. They usually are in clusters. So where the axons are together in this cluster, that's what we call a nerve. So we'll spend 2 chapters talking about nerves, which are not neurons. A neuron is the nerve cell itself with the whole thing, the axon, the dendrite, and the cell body. But the nerve is a bundle of axons. So that's kind of confusing. So I'll tell you that a couple of times, and hopefully it'll sink in eventually. Now, when you have a bunch of cell bodies, that's the big part. That's the part that has the nucleus and the mitochondria and endoplasmic reticulum. All of that stuff is in the cell body. When you have a big bundle of those, it's called a ganglion. Ganglion. And here's a place where you have a wad of them. So we'll be looking at those also. So remember that a nerve is not a nerve cell, it's a bundle of axons. And a ganglion is a bundle of nerve cell bodies or neuron cell bodies. So that's what they're talking about in this slide. The brain and the spinal cord have the skull, the cranium, around the brain, and then you have the vertebral column, all the vertebrae that protect the spinal cord. So it's really, really important, and it's very well protected. And then the rest of the nervous system is nerves and ganglia. So a nerve is a bundle of axons wrapped in fibrous connective tissue. And a ganglion is a knot-like swelling in a nerve where the neuron cell bodies are concentrated. So make sure that you spend a little time and make sure you know what these 2 words are. And I will try very, very hard to use the word neuron instead of nerve cell, but sometimes I'll slip. And I have to say, this cracked me up. So in the beginning, I showed you what it looks like with our brain and with the nerves that are coming off, the axon bundles that are coming off, and the ganglia. So here somebody went in and was looking at where they had taken the flesh and the bones away, the connective tissue away, so that you could see the actual nerves. And there's the eyes. And they said, Is it just me, or does the cat nervous system actually look like Bill the cat? I never noticed that before. So it seems like I've spent a whole lot of time saying, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, but here we are to a slide where I'm going to say, we're going to talk about this in a minute. So you can take the nervous system and divide it up in the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system, which is basically everything else. And then you can take that peripheral nervous system, which contains everything else, and you can talk about the sensory, the things that are coming in from your senses. So you smell, touch, feel, hear, all of your senses. And then the motor, that's the one that causes your muscles to move. So motoring, your muscles are moving. So you sense something, and then that causes your muscles to move. And you have the somatic, which that's your body, and your viscera, your visceral. So usually when they talk about viscera, they're talking about like your intestines, your guts, the stuff that's in your abdominal region. Again, depends on which book you're reading. All right, the sensory are going to be called afferent. So they get the information and they send it to the processing. So they're either going to take it to the spinal cord and do a reflex, or they're going to go to the spinal cord and go up to the brain and ask the brain what to do, and then they're going to send the message back down. And so they're going to carry the signal from whatever is picking up the information, from your eyes picking up sunlight, your ears picking up vibrations through your eardrum, that sort of thing. It's going to carry those signals to the central nervous system, to the spinal cord of the brain. So in lab, I hope you learned some of the receptors that are in the skin, like the Pacinian corpuscle and Meissner's corpuscle. And the visceral, like I said, that would be the stuff that's pretty much in your abdomen, including your bladder. Remember when we were talking about muscles, that the muscles that would be contracted around the bones would be the skeletal muscles. And in the skin, we talked about the erector pili, which is smooth muscle, and you have blood vessels in there, and those are also smooth muscle. So on the last slide, we talked about the sensory nerves that pick up the afferent signal. So they get the information and carry it to the central nervous system. The efferent, the motor neurons, are the ones that are going to cause an effect. So if you can remember that the effect is done by the efferent, then you'll be able to remember it, because you have like afferent, efferent. Oh man, the only difference is one starts with A and one starts with an E, so they look so much alike. But the afferent takes the message away from the senses, takes it to the central nervous system. The central nervous system sends the information back, and you get an effect. So it could be a muscle contracting, it could be a gland secreting. So efferent causes an effect. So hang on to that term, because you're going to need it. As I hinted on the slide before, the somatic motor division is the one that's going to be mostly talking to the skeletal muscles. So you're going to get muscular contractions, and you're going to get some involuntary muscle contractions. But remember, the skeletal muscles are under your control, so they are voluntary. They are voluntary. The visceral motor division is part of the autonomic nervous system. We have a whole chapter just on the autonomic nervous system, so we will revisit this. But this is going to be kind of automatic. You don't have to sit and think about it. So your glands You don't have to sit and tell your mouth, okay, now I need you to salivate because you're eating something that tastes really good. Your body just knows to do it. You don't have to sit and talk to your heart and say, okay, now I need you to beat right now. It just knows to do it. So these are on autopilot. They're autonomic. And the smooth muscles that are in your blood vessels and that are in your GI tract, which is your esophagus, your stomach, your intestines. So it's involuntary, and they call them visceral reflexes. I don't need to rely on the brain to do the visceral reflexes. And you can take the visceral, the autonomic nervous system, the smooth muscles, and you can divide them into sympathetic and parasympathetic. So the way that I look at this is if everything is going along normally, life is good, nothing's going on, you use your parasympathetics. So this is where you just have normal heart rate, normal breathing, and you're making pee and you're digesting your food and everything's cool. So that's the parasympathetic. But the sympathetic, this is the one where a lot of times they call it the flight or fight. This is when something has gotten you upset. You have strong emotions about something. You have a hormonal response. Something is going on. So when you kick in the sympathetic division, you're going to use different neurotransmitters. You're going to use a different set of nerves. And you're going to arouse the body for action. So you're going to redirect the blood. You're not worried about digesting right now. Although sometimes you get so scared that your bowels let go or your urinary system lets go, the sphincter, and you wet yourself. So that, unfortunately, is one of the common things that happens when you get really, really scared. Scared the pee out of me. Your heart rate will start racing. You will start breathing more heavily because you're getting more oxygen because you don't know whether you're going to have to fight or run. So a lot of times this is going to be under the effect of adrenaline, which we're going to call epinephrine. I would take the time to pause and learn this little table because it'll make your life a lot easier. So we talked about dividing up the whole nervous system into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And then the central nervous system is your brain, and your spinal cord. So here's your brain, your spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is a lot more complex because that's all the rest of the nerves in the body. And so you've got your sensory that's going to bring information in to the central nervous system, and your motor division, which is going to tell the body to do something, right? And the sensory, remember, is the afferent, and the motor is the efferent because you're going to get some sort of an effect. Now, then you can take the sensory and you can divide it into the visceral sensory or the body sensory or somatic sensory. Okay? And then you can do the same thing with the motor division. You've got your visceral motor, and this is not necessarily a muscle. Remember, you can also have a gland squirt something. And then your somatic motor. So visceral and somatic sensory and visceral and somatic motor. And then we can take the visceral and we can divide that into sympathetic and parasympathetic. So just stop the video and just stare at this. Take a picture with your phone. But you need to be able to work your way through this. And like I said, we're going to have a chapter on the central nervous system. We're going to have a whole chapter on the autonomic nervous system. This is one of those slides where you stare at it and you go, what? I think there's a mistake here. I think there's something wrong here. So I can tell that this is the front of the guy because there's his toes, there is his genitalia, there are his hands, but his head's on backwards. Or is that just me? Anyway, so this is where they're trying to show you where the central nervous system is, brain and spinal cord, in case you don't know where your brain and spinal cord is, and then where the peripheral nervous system is, which is all the rest of the other nerves. So, but I got so carried away trying to figure out why his head was not backwards that I had trouble with this picture. So for this next section, we're going to be looking at how are neurons alike and how are neurons different, and what are the parts of a neuron. Well, I've already kind of hinted to you that's basically axons, dendrites, and the cell body. So that's going to be pretty easy. But then we're going to start talking about how does a neuron transport materials between the cell body and all the way out to the tip of the axon. Because I talked about how the information comes into the dendrites and it goes through the cell body, and then it goes out the axon, and you get some sort of an effect at the end of the axon. So you go down to the end of the axon, you have the axon terminal and the little bitty buds off of it, which are called bouton, like button, only go through your nose, bouton. And down in the bouton is where you've got your little bags of neurotransmitter. So how did all that get down there? How did I make the little bags down there? How did I fill them up with neurotransmitter? How am I going to get the neurotransmitter back? Stuff like that. So because the axon is really, really long in a lot of cells. So here's how neurons are alike. You can pick up information. You can pick up stimulus from them. So we say they are excitable or they exhibit irritability. I find that an odd word because I have a negative connotation with irritable. Usually when you say, oh man, somebody's being so irritable today, meaning you just can't get along with them and they're just crabbing. And since my name is Karen, I get the whole Karen thing. I'm hoping years from now when people are listening to my talks and they'll go, what is that about the Karen? I hope it dies out. But right now it's very much a thing. And Karens tend to be very irritable. So it would be a negative thing. But in the case of a neuron, it's a positive thing. We need it to do this. We need it to be able to respond to touch, to pressure, to heat. And they conduct. So both muscles and neurons are conductive, and they actually have a charge across the membrane. So they actually, and then you can charge it up again, and you can depolarize it. When you depolarize it, it's no longer electrically charged. And then you have to recharge it, just like you do your cell phone. You let it go dead, and then you recharge it. And you can do that over and over again with your muscles, and you can do that over and over again with your nerves. So they are conductive. They are electrically conductive. And they secrete something out of the ends of the axon, out of the nerve fiber endings, or the axon terminals. So I wrote the word bouton in this slide for you so you can see. So in the book they just call them axon terminals, but in most books they call them bouton. And that's where the little bags or the vesicles full of neurotransmitter are. So you know in your house or your apartment how sometimes you need to connect something and you've got one part of it in one room and you got another part on the other side of the room or in the next room, and the cord just won't reach. So what you do is you get yourself an extension cord, and now it can reach. Well, in your body you have three basic functional kinds of neurons. And one of them is the sensory that we talked about. It is the afferent that picks up the information and it carries it to the central nervous system. And then we talked about the motor, which is the efferent, And it's the one that takes the message from the central nervous system and implements it by making a muscle contract or a gland secrete. So, in the spinal column, right here, you have these little extension cords, and they call them interneurons because they are between the neurons. So we have these little interneurons, and we'll revisit those when we talk about reflexes too. But those are the three functional kinds of neurons. Okay? Pick up information, cause some effect due to the information, and then connect them to the central nervous system. So you can get information that way. So there's your little extension cord, your interneuron. I know it's frustrating when you're taking a class like this and you're running into some of these words for the first time, when you have people who try to rename things. And so in the case of the nerve or neuron cell body, you can call it a soma or a neurosoma or a cell body or a perikaryon. So it depends on which book you're in and which author is writing the book as to which one they call it. So our guy who's writing this book likes to call it a soma. I personally prefer to call it a cell body because then everybody knows exactly what it is. And you're not sitting there going, wait a minute, what is a soma? Is that one of those vesicles or what is it? So you just know right away the cell body is the part that has the nucleus and the mitochondria and the endoplasmic reticulum and the ribosomes and all those other organelles that cells normally have. But it's nice that they tell you that there's a whole bunch of different names out there for the same thing. So if you run across perikaryon, you're like, you go, oh, wait a minute. Yeah, that's just the cell body. All right, so in the cell body, there's the organelles. Look at all those organelles. And you have lysosomes. I didn't even talk about that in the rough ER. And you have food. You have nutrients. You may have pigments in there. Glycogen, stored sugar. Lipid, because you need to repair things. And you have a cytoskeleton, which is a bunch of microtubules and neurofibrils. In this case, they're just talking about the actin filaments. But remember when we did muscles, we talked about actin and myosin. But in the case of this, these are neurofibrils, and so we're just talking about actin. And you're not going to find centrioles in a neuron, which is kind of interesting because remember we had the whole discussion when we did cells and we said, we know what this does, we know what that does, but we really don't know what the centrioles are doing, but they say that it has something to do with cell division. But then the people who are in botany go, well, here's the thing, guys, our cells do the same mitosis that your cells do, and we don't have any centrioles in our plants and our trees. So think again what the centrioles are doing. And so here you have neurons, which are nerve cells, and they don't have centrioles either. Now, soon after you're born, you stop being able to make new neurons. And this has been the in every textbook for as long as I've been teaching. And that's almost half a century that it's been saying that. In the last few weeks and months, they've started saying, whoa, wait a minute, hey, yeah, we're actually seeing neurons dividing beyond puberty. So they're having to change the textbook a little bit. But where they came up with that idea is if you've ever seen anyone who has a stroke, a lot of times they don't come out of it, especially if they're older. The older you are, the harder it is for you to recover from a stroke. So that's, damage to the brain usually, where you have some cells die, and then they don't come back. Alzheimer is so prevalent. It is so prevalent. Depending on which statistics you look at, 1 out of every 7 people will get it if you live long enough. So it's huge. And once you kill those nerve cells, they're not coming back. It's like you watch the person as their brain dies, and they start forgetting things, and then they start forgetting people, and then they start forgetting bodily functions. So I was working on an Alzheimer grant once upon a time, and one of the stories that they were telling was they handed a patient, an Alzheimer patient, a spoon, and she had no idea what to do with it. So she just reached up to her eye socket, put the spoon in her eye socket, and tore her eye out. Friends of mine who've had parents who had Alzheimer's, they have horror stories of what it's like. And towards the end, usually the person doesn't even know their own children, their own spouse. They don't remember any of that. That's gone. So that's one of the reasons why they said that neurons cannot undergo mitosis. But we need to say this was what we thought up until a few weeks ago, and somebody actually started looking at the brain and going, oh, look, we are still growing neurons. Besides the soma, which is the cell body, you also have the dendrites we were talking about. They mostly branch off. They have multiple branches. And then you have usually one axon. You usually have one axon where you have multiple dendrites, this tree-shaped thing. And the incoming information comes into the dendrites and it leaves through the axon. That's the way most all nerves work. And just to keep life interesting, it points out that some neurons, have no axon. So you're going to get the information in through the dendrites, and it's going to go out through the cell body because there's no axon to take the information away. So here's a friendly little cartoon to show you. Dendrites get the message, they get the information from the senses, and it is a one-way street out to the ends of the axon where you have your bouton. Normally when you're talking about a cell, you're talking about a skin cell, and you talk about the nucleus, and you talk about the cytoplasm that is inside the cell. Well, think about the nerve. It has the soma, it has the cell body, and so it's got the cytoplasm in there, but then you also have cytoplasm that runs down the axon and, of course, up into the dendrites. So when we're looking at the axon, we're going to call the cytoplasm axoplasm because it's in the axon. And instead of calling the cell membrane, which is the phospholipid bilayer that surrounds all cells, we're going to call it the axolemma. So that, when you see the word axolemma, you know that's the plasma membrane around just the axon part. So it's continuous with the cell body, but it's just like the streets. Sometimes you're driving along the street and it's named one thing, and you go through an intersection and now they name it something else. So they're doing that in the axon. And then you sometimes have, towards the end especially, the branching of the axon. But the axon usually is just one straight shot until you get down towards the end. And that's what they call terminal arborization. So an arbor would be a place where you have plants, arboretum. You have a lot of trees and plants. So you're going to branch off. That's what that means. You're going to branch off like a tree. So you have an extensive complex of fine branches at the distal end. So it's going to be a straight shot with little branches off the ends. And those axon terminals are swellings that form non-contact points. Non-contact points. You cannot have the axon touch another nerve. You cannot have the axon touch another muscle because they're both electrically charged and they'll short each other out. So what you're going to do is you're going to get the end of the axon, these axon terminals, these branchings at the very end, And you're going to get them very close to a nerve, or very close to a muscle, or very close to a gland. But you're going to leave a gap, and we're going to call that gap a synapse. So there is a synapse or a space between them, so you do not make contact. All right, so I edited it because I don't want you guys thinking that the axon terminal actually touches another cell, because it doesn't. So it's a close, near contact, but it doesn't actually touch. All right, the synaptic vesicles, these ends that are synapsing, that are very close to a muscle, nerve, or gland, have vesicles full of neurotransmitter. And the myelin out, or excuse me, the axons out in the peripheral nervous system are going to have a myelin sheath around them. And this is to insulate it, just like in your, with something you plug into the wall, to an electric socket. You've got an insulator around the outside of it to keep it from shorting out. So the insulator that we're going to put along the axon to keep it from shorting out is called a myelin sheath. And it's formed by Schwann cells. So it's one of the types of glial cells that we'll be learning. Glial cells are support cells. They're not neurons, but they are helping neurons. So they're helpers. And the myelin sheath making Schwann cell is definitely one of the necessary glial cells. Electrical signals travel faster if you have this myelinated axon. I'm returning to this picture because it kind of shows you what the myelin sheath looks like, what the Schwann cells look like. So you literally have a cell that wraps itself around and around and around the axon. And here's another cell that wrapped itself around and around and around the axon. And another one, and another one. So you're going to have these the length of the axon. And we're going to learn about saltatory conduction. So as the depolarization event occurs, it can jump and then depolarize here and jump and depolarize here. And so instead of having to go all the way through, you're going to jump, 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 jump to the end and release neurotransmitter. Now, people who have a disease that destroys the myelin sheath are going to be slowing down. So we'll talk about some of those conditions like multiple sclerosis and things like that, MS. This is a nice picture. This actually shows you a cell body, a soma, right there. And it shows you the axon, and it shows you the dendrites coming off. And then here's a cartoon version of the same thing. So you can see the nucleus in there, and you can see the nucleus here. You can see the arborization, or the dendrites, tree branchings here. And here you can see the tree branchings there. And then here's the axon, and you have one axon coming away. But in this particular one, it's branching off. So sometimes they can branch off and you can have an axon collateral coming off of it. But generally, we usually look at the ones that just have one long fibrous extension there. Okay, and this one actually has two collaterals. It branched off there and it branched off there. So, and then you get down to the arborization, or the tree branching at the axon terminals. And then if you get really, really, really close with your microscope, you'll see the little bouton on the ends of each of these that have the neurotransmitter in them. On an earlier slide, we did the functional classification of neurons. So the function is to be a sensory or an afferent, be a motor or efferent, or be an interneuron, which is kind of like a an extension cord, a hookup in the central nervous system. So those were the functional ways of classifying neurons. For the structural, for the way they actually look, you have the multipolar neuron. So you have one axon and multiple dendrites. So that would be most of your neurons. So that's what you would expect to find. And so that the blue picture that I had that was so pretty is pretty much what you're going to see. The neurons in the central nervous system are myelinated in a different way than those in the peripheral nervous system. So we'll talk about oligodendrocytes when we get into the central nervous system chapter. But they need myelin also, but they just get it a different way in the central nervous system. So those are called multipolar because you have one axon and several dendrites. So there's more than one pole. Then you have bipolar, where you have one axon and one dendrite. So these would be your olfactory cells, your sense of smell, the back of your eye, which is the retina, and the inner ear. So those are bipolar. So you don't have the branching of the axon and you don't have the branching of the dendrites. You just have one main dendrite with its branches and then the axon with its terminal branches. That's it. So bipolar, one axon, one dendrite. The unipolar have just one process. So your sensory cells that come from your skin and from your organs, the ones that tell you, that somebody is pushing up against you. You have pressure sensory cells. You have touch, if somebody just lightly brushes you versus squeezes your hand too hard. Here are some examples of a Meissner's corpuscle. This one is probably better over here than this one. Let's see if I can pull it over so you can see a little better. There you go. All right. The problem with this one is here's your skin, here's your epidermis right there, and there's your papillary layer, there's your fingerprints right there, and right there in the nipple-shaped projection of the papillary layer, you have the Meissner's corpuscle. So here is another picture right here. So here's your skin, there's your epidermis, and then you get down here, and there's your Meissner's corpuscle. So that would be if somebody lightly brushes you. So they'll stand you in good stead if you are have somebody who's trying to pickpocket you. So you're going to feel them brush up against you, and you can feel them lift your wallet out of your pocket or put their hand down in your purse and steal stuff out of your purse. Since I lived all over Europe and Japan and places, not so much pickpockets in Asia and Japan, but in especially the airports, you're covered up with pickpockets because they know people are traveling with a lot of money. So those were Meissner's corpuscles. And these are Pacinian corpuscles, and they're deep. They're down at the very bottom of the dermis, right before you get to the hypodermis. And to me, they look like an onion. It looks like you sliced into an onion. So these are deep down, and they're going to be feeling pressure. So this is just a couple of examples of what your sensory detection looks like. So looking at the Pacinian corpuscle and looking at Meissner's corpuscle, they didn't look anything like the multipolar neuron. So almost every time they talk about a neuron, they whip out a picture of the axon and the dendrite, and they tell you this is what nerves looks like. This is what nerve cells, which are neurons, look like. But now we see, oh no, there's some that look like onions. And they have a single process, and it leads away from the cell body, the soma. You're going to find these, the sensory cells in your skin. So we just saw one that's right up at the top of the dermis in the papillary layer. And then we looked at one that was deep at the bottom of the dermis, which was right above the hypodermis. And it's going to send the information to the spinal cord. And then you have some neurons that have a lot of dendrites, but they don't have an axon. And they gave you a couple of examples there. The retina of your eye again. So in the retina you have bipolar, and you have some that don't have axons. And in your brain you have some neurons that don't have an axon. And then in your adrenal glands. So when we do the chapter on the endocrine system, we're going to find that on top of your kidney, it looks like somebody chewed some gum and just stuck it up on top of your kidney and left it sitting there. And that little wad of stuff that's sitting on top of your kidney is actually your adrenal gland. You've got one on each kidney. So it's going to have some unusual nerves in it. Neurons in it. So here are your four structural. So here's an artist representation of the four different kinds. And here you have one axon and multiple dendrites. Here you have one axon, one dendrite. Now this would be hard to tell which way's which. Which one is the axon and which one is the dendrite? Could go either way because they both are branching. So just looking at it, it would be difficult. And then here's another one. Here is your, that is your bipolar. And then your unipolar. Here's dendrites. Oh, excuse me. Let me get this right. All right, this is one of your more unusual ones. So there's your cell body, your soma, right there. And coming off of it is an axon. So that's why they say it's one polar, because that is the axon right there. And where this branches off into the axon terminals and bouton, this one is going to go on, and it's the dendrites. So this one's really unusual. So that's why in a intro course like we're talking about, we almost always just talk about the multipolar, and we don't get into the others, but they're letting you know that there are some unusual neurons out there. And then there's the one that doesn't even have an axon. It's just all dendrites and no axons. I want to point out something on this slide that looks like they're saying something incorrectly. It's a paradox. A paradox is where somebody tells you the truth, but the way they tell it makes you not believe it. You're like, no, both things can't be true. So here it's going to tell you that axonal transport can go in either direction. And I just told you that the axon only depolarizes in one direction. So both of those statements are true. The depolarization event takes place at the cell membrane, the axolemma, the outer part. So, and it goes down the axon, down to the very end where you have the axon terminals and you have the bouton that have the little bags of neurotransmitter, the little vesicles of neurotransmitter, and it goes in that direction. But what they're talking about transportation in either direction is you're going to have nutrients, you're going to have waste, you're going to have other things that are transported around in the cell. You even transport mitochondria. So it's kind of fun watching them. It gets on like a conveyor belt, and you see the axon pulling the mitochondria one way or pulling the mitochondria the other way. So it's kind of neat. It's where you need the ATP energy. So you just pull the ATP energy making organelle where you need it to be. So you can have anterograde transport, which is going down the axon, which is the same way that the axon would depolarize when it's going to release neurotransmitter. But you can also have retrograde transport, and that will go up the axon towards the cell body. But this is not the way the cell depolarizes. So that's why when you see this transport can go either way, you're like, Wait a minute, she just told me it can only go in one direction. But I wasn't talking about food and other things. I was only talking about the electrical current. So how do you carry things down the axon? How do you carry things back up the axon? Well, you have microtubules in there that are kind of like the highway. They're where the path is. And then on the microtubules, you have what we call motor proteins that are carrying the material along. So if it is going anterograde, which is going down the axon, it's done by a molecule called kinesin. And if you're bringing something back up the microtubule, then you have dynein. You have dynein, which does the retrograde transport. Now, this is a whole bunch of words. We've got anterograde, retrograde, kinesin, dynein, microtubules, motor proteins. We've got all of these words. So one of the cool things, somebody at Harvard made the neatest video. So I'm going to just show you a little clip of the video, and I encourage you to watch the whole thing. So the video is called The Inner Life of a Cell. And here we have the microtubule, and here we have kinesin carrying something down. So there's your motor protein carrying this down towards the end of the axon. I'm going to put a plug in for something. If you have time on your hands and you want something really interesting, go and look at TED Talks, TED, TED Talks. Used to, you'd have to pay like $6,000 to get a seat to go. You'd have to fly to wherever the TED Talk was being held. And usually they filled up so fast that, you couldn't even get a seat. And somebody finally said, well, why don't we put the TED Talks on YouTube? So this is an excerpt from one of the TED Talks. I'm going to show you just a little bit of this TED Talk.
That create the living fabric of your body. Now, molecules are really, really tiny. And by tiny, I mean really. They're smaller than the wavelength of light, so we have no way to directly observe them. But through science, we do have a fairly good idea of what's going on down at the molecular scale. So what we can do is actually tell you about the molecules, but we don't really have a direct way of showing you the molecules.
I fast forwarded so we could watch.
Down the microtubules. That is the signal broadcasting system sending out the stop signal, and it's walked away. I mean, it's that mechanical. It's molecular clockwork. This is how you work at the molecular scale. So with a little bit of molecular eye candy, we've got kinesins, which are the orange ones. They're little molecular courier molecules walking one way. And here are the dynein. They're carrying that broadcasting system, and they've got their long legs so they can step around obstacles and so on. So again, this is all derived accurately from the science. The problem is we can't show it to you any other way. Exploring at the...
So what are they carrying down the axon? Well, you can carry whole organelles. Mitochondria we talked about. You can take enzymes down there. You need those synaptic vesicles. So think about, where do you make the vesicles? You make it in the Golgi apparatus, and the Golgi apparatus is up there in the soma. It's up in the cell body. So you need to make those vesicles, and you need to take them down all the way down to the end of the axon and put them in the bouton so that you have the neurotransmitter in the little bags ready to be released when you need to talk to a muscle, a gland, or another nerve. And what do you bring back? What do you do retrograde? What do you bring back to the cell body? Recycled materials, things that you need to fix, you need to do something with up in the cell body. But unfortunately, here are some pathogens that also can hook a ride. So rabies can do retrograde transport up an axon, herpes simplex, and tetanus. So there are some pathogens that are retrograde, carried up the axon, and then they get into the cell body and they wreak havoc in the cell body. And then we have the anterograde. So these are going to be the cytoskeleton components, because you're going to have to keep rebuilding the axon. You're growing the axon. It's got to reach out. It's got to touch muscles. It's got to touch glands, things like that. So you're constantly having to rebuild the cytoskeleton. And so you're going to carry the components down so that you can use them to build. And so these are going to be a lot slower than these things. So I'm going to leave you at the end of this particular talk with this picture. Remember the messaging, the message, the electricity is going along the outer membrane, the cell membrane, the axolemma, and it only goes towards the end. But inside, you have those microtubules, and you can carry things back and forth inside. So don't let this confuse you.